Okay, so we begin with the summary of the Parsha. You can pull it up here. Okay. So Vayechi in a nutshell. Vayechi literally means, and he lived. So the verse reads as follows. So the summary reads as follows: Jacob lives the final 17 years of his life in Egypt. Before his passing, he asks Joseph to take an oath that he will bury him in the Holy Land. He blesses Joseph's two sons, Monash and Efrain, elevating them to the status of his own sons as progenitors of tribes within the nation of Israel. So there are, I guess, in some sense, there's the question of who's the firstborn, right? And the firstborn gets a double portion. So one way to read this is that Joseph is becoming the firstborn. Joseph is getting the double portion in the sense that Joseph's tribe is becoming two tribes, Menashe and Ephraim. In any case, the patriarch desires to reveal the end of days to his children, but is prevented from doing so. Jacob blesses his sons, assigning to each his role as a tribe. And this is the blessings that he blesses them before he passes. Judah will produce leaders, legislators, and kings. Priests will come from Levi, scholars from Yisachar, seafarers from Zebulun, school teachers from Simon, soldiers from Gad, judges from Dan, olive growers from Asher, and so on. Reuben is rebuked for confusing his father's marriage bed, which is the story with Bilhah. We'll get into that some other time, maybe later. Simon and Levi for the massacre of Shechem and the plot against Joseph. Naphtali is granted the swiftness of a deer, Benjamin the ferociousness of a wolf, and Joseph was blessed with beauty and fertility. So this is just doesn't really do justice to the beauty and the poetry of the blessings of Jacob on his deathbed, and they're very poetic, and it's not exactly clear what it refers to, and therefore there are many commentators and many layers of commentary of what exactly Jacob is referring to, but it's certainly beautiful. So that's when we get to toward the end of the parsha, the Torah goes into a great length to describe the funeral. It's actually surprising of how much ink is used, how many verses is used to describe the funeral. But here we go. A large funeral procession consisting of Jacob's descendants, Pharaoh's ministers, the leading citizens of Egypt, and the Egyptian cavalry accompanies Jacob in his final journey to the Holy Land, where he is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Joseph too dies in Egypt at the age of 111. He too instructs that his bones be taken out of Egypt and buried in the Holy Land. But this would come to pass only with the Israelites' exodus from Egypt many years later. Before his passing, Joseph conveys to the children of Israel the statement from which they will draw their hope and faith in the difficult years to come. God will surely remember you and bring you up out of this land to the land with which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is the conclusion of the nutshell. And that's the story in short, I guess. I think we always start from the beginning. I think maybe for this year, maybe we should start from the end. I think we should start from the end a little bit. We want to talk about the funeral of Jacob, talk about the passing of Joseph, and think about what's the lesson, what's the Torah trying to convey with the way it tells this story. So I think we'll do that, and then we'll go back to the beginning, and if we have time, we'll go to the middle. Okay, so this takes us to the sixth reading, and the beginning of the sixth reading is the conclusion of the blessing, and verse 29 is chapter 49. Verse 29, he gathered all of his children, he blessed them, gave each one a specific blessing. 3 of them actually did not receive blessings, they received rebuke. But in any case, when at the conclusion in verse 28, he gives a general blessing to everybody. That's how Rashi reads verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them and blessed them. Each man according to his blessing, he blessed them. What does it mean? Each man according to his blessing, he blessed them. So let's see what Rashi says. Rashi says, I'm pretty sure Rashi is going to say this. Yes, he blessed them. Scripture should have said, each man according to his blessing, he blessed him. Why does Scripture say he blessed them? So the answer is, since he, Jacob, bestowed upon Judah the might of a lion, and upon Benjamin the power to seize like a wolf, and upon Naphtali the fleetness of a gazelle, I might think that he did not include all of them in all the blessings. Therefore, Scripture states he blessed them. What's Rashi telling us? Rashi's telling us each individual tribe has an individual blessing. However, the individual blessing for that tribe is not only for that tribe. That is the tribe that in which this quality is most dominant. Yet, at the end, what Jacob says is that everybody should have everybody's blessings. So that's an important idea, because even the tribes, the sons that were not blessed, they were rebuked, they're also included within the blessings. So I just want to say one more thing before we get to the funeral procession. This verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. It's not just a summary. This verse is a very powerful verse. This verse, in some sense, if you know nothing about what's going to unfold, if you don't know the rest of Jewish history, if all you know is you open up the book of Genesis from the beginning and you read till here, you would probably be very surprised to read verse 28. Why so? Because this is the first time in the history of all of the book of Genesis where within the quote unquote chosen family, all the children are included. Right? If you go back all the way back, Cain and Hevel. So Hevel was killed, Cain was rejected. Ultimately, Seth was chosen. And if you go through Abraham, of course, and Isaac, Abraham, Ishmael was sent away, and with Isaac, Esau was sent away. Only one of the children were chosen. And that probably is really the background of the great conflict between Joseph and his brothers. What we don't understand is we say, why, if you can't get along with your brother, okay, that's fine, but why would you sell your brother as a slave? So it could be that understanding it against the backdrop of this family where historically one person was chosen and everybody else was sent away would mean for the tribes that if Joseph was chosen, then they would not have part in the Jewish story. And therefore they would feel spiritually threatened by Joseph being chosen. What this verse is telling us, that with Jacob, the model changes. With Jacob, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, all of the children, both the ones who were chosen for leadership, different various leadership roles, because as you will see, if we have time, the different forms of leadership will really split. But in any case, all the tribes, the ones who were blessed and even the ones who were rebuked, are all part of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is the big change. And that's the big news. In other words, that's actually very surprising because it breaks the pattern of the book until this point. And again, the idea here is that every individual tribe within the Jewish people has a unique approach to life, a unique blessing, a unique way of serving God, a unique mission in life. But collectively, they all come together to form one nation, and each tribe makes a contribution to the other tribes, and ultimately, that's how you get the full potential of the Jewish people is not by having one child who is chosen, but by having 12 different children with 12 different paths. Okay, fine. So that's about verse 28. Now we go to verse 29, and we hear Jacob's speech. And it's very interesting. I don't know if we should get into it right now, but in the beginning of the parsha, Jacob speaks to Joseph. And he says, Joseph, do me a favor, don't bury me in Egypt, bring me back to my fathers. Because why does he speak to Joseph? Because Joseph is the one man with the power. Joseph is the king. But here, it's actually, he reiterates his request to all of his children. In other words, if you read the beginning of the parsha, it seems like, oh, Joseph is his favorite child for whatever reason, but Joseph is the one, the responsibility to bury him where he wants to be buried is in the hands of Joseph. But that's only at the beginning of the parsha. At the end of the parsha, he reiterates the request to be buried with his parents. He reiterates it to everybody. And that's verse 29. And he commanded them and said to them, I will be brought to my people, which is in the Bible, that's an expression of passing on. I'll be brought to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. And now, we know about this cave. This cave has been spoken about earlier in Genesis. We have a whole long discussion of how it was purchased. But here, Jacob is speaking about it at great length. He mentioned the cave. He mentioned it's in the field of Ephron. Verse 30 and 31 and 32 is really a reiteration of things we already know. In the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which field Avraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for burial property. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and the cave therein was from the sons of Het. So I know all of this. We have 4 verses discussing where he wants to be buried. It's interesting because you compare it earlier in the Parsha he says very short, just bury me with my parents. But here he speaks about it at great length. Then he passes away. Verse 33. Jacob concluded commanding his sons, and he drew his legs up onto the bed and expired and was brought to his people. So he passes on. What happens when he passes on? Verse chapter 50, Joseph fell on his father's face, and he wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And now we have this whole discussion. Again, verse 3, and 40 days were completed for him to so are the days of embalming completed, and the Egyptians wept over him for 70 days. Verse 4 and 5 is Joseph negotiating with Pharaoh, which we'll skip. And all of a sudden, verse 7, we have a discussion of the funeral. No less than verse 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 verses. I'm sorry, not 13 verses, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 verses discussing the funeral. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and all of Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went up with him. And Joseph's entire household, and his brothers, and his father's household, only their young children and their flocks and cattle did they leave in the land of Goshen. And chariots and horsemen also went up with them, and the camp was very numerous. And they came to the threshing floor of the thorn bushes, which is on the other side of the Jordan. And there they conducted a very great and impressive eulogy. And he made for his father a mourning of 7 days. The Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of the thorn bushes, and they said, "This is an intense mourning for the Egyptians." Therefore they named it Avel Mitzrayim, Egypt mourns, which is on the other side of the Jordan. And his sons did to him as he commanded them. Verse 13. And his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and they buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which field Avram had bought for a burial property from Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to bore you. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to show you that the Torah describes his funeral at great length. And when the previous funerals, when Abraham is buried, there's one verse. When Isaac is buried, there's one verse. And here we have just verse after verse describing the funeral and the procession and how they went and how they came back. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So that's one funeral that occurs at the end of the parsha. And then there's another passing, as we know, because you read the nutshell. There's also one more passing, which is a little bit different, but that is the passing of Joseph. So let's turn to the final reading, passing of Joseph. Here, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am going to die. God will surely remember you and take you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob." And Joseph adjured the children of Israel, saying, "God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here." So in other words, he makes the children of Israel swear that when they leave Egypt, eventually they will, in fact, take him with them out of Egypt, to be buried in Israel, And that's exactly what happens as we read later in the book of Exodus. And finally, we get to the culmination, the final verse of the book of Exodus. And Joseph dies at the age of 110 years, and they embalmed him, and he was placed into the coffin in Egypt. Okay, so we really have, the book concludes, in some sense, the descent into Egypt, or the preparation for the next book, for the book of Exodus, when the Jewish people are in Egypt. The Torah spends a lot of time describing the funeral of Jacob, and in some sense also telling us the opposite, how Joseph does not have a funeral like Jacob. In other words, Jacob is the one who gets his body, he orchestrates for his body to be moved back to Israel immediately, and Joseph cannot. All Joseph can do is tell them, well, when you leave Egypt, you take me with you. Why the change? So the change is very simple, because Joseph was the second to the king, so he was powerful. So he could convince Pharaoh to let them ascend and make the funeral. When Joseph passes away, the Egyptians want to keep him in Egypt. And the Jewish people really have no power to change that. So all Joseph could do is, eventually, when you go back to Israel, take me with you, and that's exactly what happens. But if you notice, the Torah does actually say, conclude with a word that implies that even though Joseph is still in Egypt, but it's really still temporary, right? Because what does the verse say? The verse says, doesn't say he was buried. The verse reads, and he was placed into the coffin in Egypt. Being placed into a coffin is not the way you would describe a burial. So in other words, he's placed into a coffin in the sense that it's waiting to move, waiting for the time to come to be buried elsewhere back in the land of Israel. And that's the conclusion of the Parsha. Okay, so what's really happening here, and why am I spending so much time on this? So the Jewish people are in Egypt, and they have to prepare for the stay in Egypt. The stay in Egypt is going to be a total of 210 years, so it's a significant amount of time. What will allow the Jewish people to survive in the foreign land, in the hostile environment of Egypt? So in some sense, they need to keep two things in mind. Before you can begin the slavery in the next book, the Torah wants to make sure that we remember two things. What are the two things we need to remember? Number one, that Egypt is not our place. What is our place? Our place is the land of Israel, right? The danger is if you come and you settle in a land and you're there for too long, then you acclimate and you adapt their culture and you adapt their way of life and their philosophy, and ultimately you melt in the melting pot and you forget your own identity. So the Torah wants to emphasize and remind us and remind the Jewish people that Egypt is not our place. It's not our ancestral land. And that could be why the Torah is spending all that time talking about the preparation and the funeral, and it had to make the news, and all the people of Canaan, all the kings of Canaan heard about this, and they all came and they all spoke about this great event of the burial. It was making headlines for many months. What is the purpose of all this? Why do I have to know this? I have to know this because that reiterates to the Jewish people, reminds them that your place is not really Egypt. That's not your parents' home. Your place is in the land of Israel. That's where the burial spot of your parents is. That's where your roots are. So keeping us connected to your roots, perhaps the funeral is actually one way of talking about the connection to our past. Now, that's one theme. That's one idea. Remembering the past. That's one theme. And another theme is thinking about being hopeful for the future. And here is what the Rebbe once gave a beautiful talk on the final verse of the Torah, of the book of Genesis. So the final book of the final verse of the book of Genesis ends on a sad note, right? Joseph was placed in the coffin in Egypt. We know what Egypt means. Egypt is sort of the slavery around the corner. So it ends on a very negative note. Now, so that everyone's asked the question, the rule is you try to end on a positive note. So what we could have done, we actually could have switched verse 25 and 26, because verse 25 is a very positive note. What is verse 5? It's verse 25. Verse 25 is very hopeful. And Joseph adjured the children of Israel, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. So he could have said Joseph died, and before he died, he told the people to take them out of here. And verse 25 would be much more encouraging than verse 26. So if the rule is that we want to conclude with something positive, why don't we conclude with 25 and put 26 before 25? So this was the question. And the answer that Rebbe gave is a beautiful answer. The fact that Joseph is with them in Egypt, and he wasn't buried, he was only placed in the coffin. By the way, the tradition is that the Egyptians took the coffin and put it in the Nile, in the bottom of the Nile. But in any case, the fact that the Jewish people know that Joseph is with them, that reminds them constantly of the story of Joseph. And the story of Joseph really gives them hope for the future. Because what is the story of Joseph? If you look at the last four portions, or you read the story of Joseph, what is the story of Joseph? What is the character of Joseph? First of all, his own attitude, but also his life story. His life story basically tells you that no matter how low you will fall, he was sold as a slave, and then he becomes actually put in prison. But what does he learn? What does Joseph's story tell us? It tells us that no matter how low a person could fall, a person should always retain the hope, because the person could grow just like Joseph and go from the prison all the way to the height of power. So Joseph's life story is actually the greatest encouragement that the Jewish people would need to survive the Egyptian exile. So in other words, in short, if you want to summarize everything we said in the last 25 minutes, is that you have two stories of funerals at the end of the Parsha. We have Jacob's funeral and we have Joseph's passing. And both of them are important for the Jewish people to be able to think about, to remind them who they are, so that they will be able to survive the exile. And the two themes are, number one, remember the past. Remember the past is remember that you're coming. This is not your ancestral land. Your ancestral land is in Israel. And you want to know the history of your ancestral land. So Jacob gives the whole history of the sale, many verses. And the funeral says, this is not our place. We have to go back to our ancestral land. So that's thinking of the past, being cognizant of the past. And then we have thinking about the present and the future, and the fact that Joseph is with the Jewish people. Joseph's body is with the Jewish people in Egypt. That is sort of a reminder that the message of Joseph is with them currently, giving them hope for the future. Because you can't survive unless you have an eye on the past. You understand your history, but also just living in the past is not enough. You also have to you have to be hopeful for the future. And perhaps that both these themes are the reason why the Torah spends so much time talking about the passing of Jacob, and then sometime about the passing of Joseph, but concludes with the passing of Joseph, because this is the awareness that the Jewish people should have in order for them to survive the exile. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, listening to the story of those burials, Joseph clearly understood that with his passing, the Egyptians gonna have control over Jewish people. So he clearly understood that, and he is warning them about exile, but says nothing about the slavery. So knowing that his prophecy level, he could have warned them about being enslaved in Egypt, because he predicted that, right?
Yeah, so that's interesting. What exactly did Joseph tell them? I don't know. We know that somebody in the family knew. In other words, they had the covenant between the parts. In other words, they had the tradition, what was told to Abraham, right? It was told to Abraham that your descendants will be foreigners in a foreign land for 400 years. They will be enslaved, and then I will take them out with an outstretched arm. So they knew that, right? They didn't know it's going to be in Egypt. They didn't know when the clock is starting to tick, but they had some information. What exactly did Joseph tell them? I don't know. But within the mess, what did they know before he told them? I don't know. What exactly he told them? We don't know. What's interesting is Joseph did give them two, but what you see from Joseph focuses on the hope, right? And that's to your point. He doesn't say you're going to be enslaved. Either they know it or they'll figure it out, right? But what he does say is not the negative. He says what you have to bear in mind is verse 25, right? God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. So in other words, what he's giving them, his last statement is not just where to bury me, but it's much deeper. He's giving them the ability to hope. By the way, in Hebrew, there's two ways to say remember. There's a very common word, which is zachor, to remember. Many commandments in the Torah begin with zachor et yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. The 10 Commandments, remember the Shabbat, to sanctify it. It uses the term zachor. The word pakod is used, but it's much less often. It's not the common word for remember. Here it says pakod yifkod, remember, will remember. Double language in Hebrew is emphasis. Now, the tradition is that Joseph tells them, this is not just a vague idea that God will remember you, but Joseph is actually giving them a code. And he says, when somebody will come and evoke this phrase, you know that this is God sending him. And indeed, when Moshe is sent to the Jewish people, God gives him the message, and the message is exactly these words, pakod pakadati, but not in the common term, which is remember, zachor, and also I remembered you. That's just say I'm going to redeem you. No, the same words that Joseph uses are the words that Moshe uses. So he's giving them hope, but he's also giving them according to the Medrash, he's giving them a tangible test to see who is going to be that when somebody comes, so you can be able to believe him. So again, your point is correct, that Joseph doesn't really tell them everything. I'm just not sure how much they know already, because they had the tradition, and we know that people in the family made decisions based on that tradition. We know that Esau said, I'm leaving the land of Israel because I don't want to have anything to do with this obligation to be enslaved before you come back to Israel. So I'd rather not get the land of Israel and not be enslaved, so I'm moving out of town, right? And Jacob and his descendants who choose to stay in Israel, they still choose to live the legacy of Abraham, so they know that there's a price to pay, right? So I don't know what they know, what they don't know, but here Joseph is saying God will remember you. And if you need any proof that when a person falls very low, that they could turn around, their fortunes could turn around, if you need any proof, then Joseph himself is the greatest proof.
Right, you're right.
So,
thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, that was beautiful, because in his lifetime, he kind of
yes.
modeled that kind of
His attitude himself, he always believed in it. Even when he was very low, he was always upbeat, and he always believed in his own dreams. But forget about that's the subjective. That's how he acted. Forget about how he acted. Just this events that happened to him it's really a story of hope. It's really a story of a dreamer who always believes in his dreams. And if you don't believe in your dreams, you're not going to survive the exile.
right. Yeah, and to his defense, he may not know all the details. He didn't have to know.
He may have known, you're right. That's a good point. He may have known what everyone else knew. I don't know that he had more or less. I don't know.
Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Jill wanted to ask something. Jill, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to, oh, wait. Oh, yeah, I am not muted. It was just a very minor point. They never got buried in Egypt. If they were embalmed, they didn't have to be buried. And that was the reason they were embalmed, so they didn't disintegrate. So that was just the form. So he was always available to be taken.
Correct. I just mentioned that we know that they put them in caves and they closed off the caves. In other words, it was, even though they didn't bury in the ground, but there was a certain idea of letting the dead rest. Here in the ark, so in the Aron, in an ark, the ark, in our mind, you think about the ark of the Torah, that you literally have poles and you're literally carrying wherever you go. Again, I'm not saying this for certain, but to me, it sounds like a transient. It sounds like, oh, we're in an ark. Tomorrow, we're still in the suitcases, So you're right that in Egypt, they would not bury in the earth. But I still think there's something to be said for the way the Torah chooses to write this is to imply that, we're just in an ark. We're on the way. We may have to wait 200 years, but it was less than 200 years at that point. But it was less than 200 years at that point, but we may have to wait almost 200 years, but it's just temporary. So I'm not disagreeing with you. Go ahead, Neil.
Question for you, Rabbi. What is the idea behind the Egyptians putting Joseph's coffin at the bottom of the Nile? Is that a sign of disrespect?
So I don't know. I think that not necessarily, because in the Nile was one of the deities of Egypt. In other words, they worshiped the Nile. So I think that for them, from their perspective, part of this is to show, look, what does Joseph represent? Joseph represents the force, the person who saved the Egyptian economy, right? So attributing that to the Nile, putting him back in the Nile is a way of attributing Joseph's success to their culture, to their deity. That's how I would read it, but I have no idea. I don't know what the Medrash is alluding to. Certainly, mystically speaking, there's some truth to that. There's the Kabbalistic interpretation. Next week's parsha, we know that that the Egyptians want to throw the Jewish newborn babies or sons, males, into the Nile. So that's just a way of killing them. Okay, that's one way, but there are other ways to kill. So mystically speaking, throwing them into the Nile represents that they become subsumed into the might and the might of Egypt. So the Nile represents the might of Egypt. So to say that the might of Egypt is the strongest thing and that will crush the Jewish children. And ultimately, Moses himself, we think about next week, if we're jumping ahead, Moses himself is placed in the Nile and saved by the Nile, right? So the might of Egypt is not able to suppress the power of the Jew, right? So there's a lot of symbolism. Anytime you mention Nile, there's a lot of symbolism here. So I don't know exactly what the Medrash is referring to, but I, as a reader, when you tell me that Joseph is placed in the Nile, again, the text doesn't say it. The Medrash says it. To me, it seems like the Medrash is signaling that the Jewish people want that the Egyptians want to attribute Joseph's power to the Nile. It's like I hate to get political here, but the Arabs refer to Maimonides as a Muslim scholar. Okay, we know he happens to be Jewish, right? That he was a great Jewish scholar. So you see, when there's a force of an important figure, everyone's trying to say, "Oh no, they're part of my culture." Right? They're part of my culture. So in other words, I'm taking Joseph and explaining Joseph. And we see Joseph, we see the hand of God, right? They see Joseph, they see, oh, Joseph understands the power of the Nile and he figures out how to save the Egyptian economy, right? So what story does Joseph tell? Right? The storyteller gets to put Joseph's story in a certain context. And we have our story, which is what Joseph himself says earlier and reiterates in this parsha, which we'll see later, where he says, you tried to do bad to me, but God intended it for the good. So that's Joseph's telling of his own story, which is, you can try to harm me and the bad things that befall me happen, but they happen for a positive purpose because it's the hand of God. That's Joseph telling his story. But believe me, if you went to the Egyptian and say, who is Joseph? They would tell you a completely different story. And I don't know what the story they would tell you is, but my guess is they would say something about the Nile. They would say, he understood, he interpreted the dreams, he understood how the Nile works, and he understood when the Nile goes up and when the Nile goes down, and therefore he was able to save the Egyptian economy because he understood the power and the might of Egypt, which is the Nile. So I don't know, like I said, I don't know what story they would say, but they would say some story incorporating Joseph into their bigger narrative of the Nile, which represents the power of the physical world, the power of Egypt. So that's all I could say.
So Kabbalistically, would it be seen that if Joseph is in the Nile, that would be protection?
I wouldn't say protection. I would say Joseph being placed in the Nile would be the battle, the weakening. Ultimately, the Nile is weakened because of the force of Joseph that's there. Because if you think, okay, well, I'm jumping ahead, but next week we read, according to the Medrash at least, we know there was a decree to kill the male sons. We know that at some point the decree stopped. According to the Medrash, when did the decree stop? The decree stopped. When did the decree stop? The decree stopped when Moshe was placed in the Nile. Because the problem was like this. Pharaoh's astrologers told him that the one who's the savior of the Jews is ultimately going to be punished by water. So they think it means that it refers to the fact that Moshe hit the rock. But in any case, they think that they could put Moshe in the water and drown the savior of the Jewish people. When Moshe's mother puts him in the Nile, so the astrologers come to the Pharaoh and say, you know what, it's all been done. We could sense that Moshe was placed, that the savior of the Jewish people was placed in the Nile. Now they don't understand. Placed or drowned doesn't matter. So according to the Medrash, when Moshe was placed in the Nile, at that point, the decree to kill the male children ceased. Okay, so in other words, Moshe being placed in the Nile represents a weakening of the Nile, in the sense, the weakening of the decree against the Jewish people represented by the Nile. So again, it's not in the simple verse, it's the Medrash. And again, when you come to the Medrash, I don't know if my interpretation is the correct one, but this is I'm just telling you the impression I get as when I read it. Okay, so let's jump back for a second and connect these two ideas to the beginning of the Parsha, which is also very interesting. We discussed it yesterday at great length, but I wanted to spend 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes on this, which is Monash and Efrain. What happens in the beginning of the Parsha, before Jacob blesses all of his children, he recalls, Joseph shows up with his 2 sons, and we have the story where Jacob blesses the 2 sons, Monash and Efrain, and he gives a very profound blessing. And he says like this, he says, in you, with Monash and Ephraim, Israel, meaning all the Jewish people, will bless their children. When somebody wants to bless their children, they'll say, or their sons, they'll say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And that's what people do till today. There's many customs where the parents bless their children every single Friday. It's not a Chabad custom. In Chabad custom, it's only once a year before Yom Kippur. But in any case, if you open up most Sidurim, most prayer books, it would say this phrase, may God make you like Manasseh and Ephraim. Not like the patriarchs. It's very interesting, not like the patriarchs. By the way, when you're going to bless your daughters, you say, may God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, evoking the matriarchs. But there's no blessing. We don't tell our sons we should be like the patriarchs. We say you should be like Manasseh and Ephraim. And that's because who said this? Jacob says this. So that's very interesting. Why so? So we'll look at that for a minute, and then we'll try to connect it to the end of the parsha that we just discussed. Okay, so here it is. So Joseph comes to, this is the first reading. Go ahead, Jill, go ahead.
Okay, the blessing for Joseph was beauty and prosperity. And so this to me might answer your question. Since it's to Joseph, it devolves upon his sons. Okay. And then it devolves upon all the children that are blessed.
That's a good answer. So you're saying that Jacob is really honoring Joseph.
And that's the only really unadulterated, that's the most wonderful blessing of all and the best, and it's unfair, I think. Right. But it does devolve upon the children.
Okay, so that's certainly one interpretation. I'll give you a Hasidic interpretation, which you may like more, may like less, but you'll have a choice. You can go home and you can choose the one you like. Okay, is that a deal?
It's a deal.
Deal. Okay. So here it goes. So Jacob is talking to Joseph, and he says as follows, and now, as for your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, until I came to you, to the land of Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, like Reuven and Shimon. But your children, if you beget any after them, they shall be yours. By their brothers' names, they shall be called in their inheritance. In other words, the first will be becoming mine. Your other sons, if you may have, they'll be yours. And then he gives a whole speech about Rachel, which I don't know if we'll get to right now. Maybe we'll have time. We'll see. But we'll turn the page, and here he says the powerful blessing. He says, blesses them again, and the blessing goes a long time. Wow. In any case, in verse 20, at the end of the blessing, he says, so he blessed them on that day, saying, with you, Israel will bless them, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh. And he placed Ephraim before Manasseh, because that was the whole story previously, where he crosses his hands and puts his right hand on the head of the younger son. But in any case, that's the verse. He says, in you, the Jewish people will bless their children, say, may God make you like Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, why not Joseph? If he loves Joseph, say Joseph. Why Manasseh and Ephraim? So Jill says, well, Manasseh and Ephraim is just the expression of Joseph. That's a fine interpretation. I have no problem with that. But here's the Hasidic interpretation. Hasidic interpretation says, you have to look back and you have to see how he describes the 2 sons. And that will be the answer. That will be the clue as to why it's actually more important to bless them, like to be like Manasseh and Ephraim, more than the patriarchs. And now, as for your 2 sons, so the first thing I wanted to say before you even read this verse, there's another interpretation, which is also Hasidic, not Chabad, but it's another Hasidic interpretation, and that ties to what we discussed last week, right? We discussed it last week and we said that we went through all the siblings in Genesis and we explained how within all the siblings of Genesis, there's always rivalry, especially when the younger one is chosen, that causes rivalry. And the first time, right, we discussed this last week, the first time where the younger one was chosen and yet the older one was not jealous, the first time is this story of Monash and Efrain. So some people read, that's why they merited to be blessed in that way. And if you notice, the blessing that where he says, may God make you like Monash and Ephraim, happens when? After Jacob crosses his hands. And Joseph protests, but the younger one doesn't. And Jacob senses that the grandchildren will be able to work together, despite the fact that the younger one was chosen. So that's one interpretation, just in line with what we said last week. But now we get to the Hasidic interpretation. Why is Monash and Ephraim the paradigm of blessing? We want our children to be like them even more than the patriarchs. And like I said, we have nothing against the patriarchs, because look, we bless our daughters to be like the matriarchs. So here we go. So here he says, so the Rebbe's interpretation is as follows, verse 5. And now, as for your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt until I came to you to the land of Egypt. Now, we know this. We know that Manasseh and Ephraim were born in Egypt before Jacob came to Egypt. We know this. Why does Jacob have to reiterate it? The answer is, this verse is not describing who Manasseh and Ephraim are. Both Jacob and Joseph and the reader of the book, we all know who they are. We all know they were born to Joseph before Jacob comes to Egypt. So what is the interpretation? The interpretation is, this is the reason why they're going to be blessed. They are blessed because they have a unique strength and power, that they were born to Joseph in Egypt. They never had any sense of living in Israel with the culture of their patriarchs and matriarchs. And nevertheless, they were able to grow in the land of Egypt, and as people believing in the legacy of Abraham and living the life of the descendants of Abraham. So when Jacob comes to Egypt and he sees Joseph, but Joseph, he maintained the legacy, he maintained the lifestyle of his youth. In other words, he maintained the belief system of his youth. But the fact that the next generation, born and bred in Egypt, could actually have no Jewish friends, right? And they have no environment of a Jewish environment reinforcing their values. And nevertheless, they can remain loyal to Jacob and Jacob's legacy. That Jacob is absolutely blown away. And he says, you know something? More than a blessing, it's an aspiration. Everyone should be like you, because that's the quality we need. That's the quality we need for survival. So the patriarchs are wonderful, but what are patriarchs? Patriarchs are the parents. And the purpose of the parents is to give birth to children. And we are the children that were able to live the legacy of the patriarchs, even though they were in a distant land and they didn't know how to have the environment to be able to do so. That's Monash and Ephraim. And you know what? That's why they get the blessing. And what's the blessing? It's not a blessing. That's why Jacob highlights that quality is the most important quality. Okay, so now the roadmap is like this. I want to spend 2-3 more minutes talking about Monash and Ephraim, connected to the end of the parsha, and then do something we never did. I want to just read the poetry of the blessings to all 12 sons, and maybe just address a little bit from Rashi, just so we get an understanding of what's going on. Hopefully we can do that in 10 minutes. I think it will be fun to do. So let's try to do that. But before we even go there, let's talk about Monash and Ephraim for a minute. We discussed it yesterday at some length. If you go back to the names Monash and Ephraim, they're interesting names. Joseph is, remember, Joseph gives birth to 2 sons in Egypt before his parents come. He names the first son Menashe, and he names the second one Ephraim. So if you look back in the Parsha, the Parsha's Miketz, 3 portions ago, you see the reason why he gives this name. So when it comes to Menashe, he says, God made me forget my sorrow and my father's home. And when it comes to Ephraim, Menashe comes from the word forget. When it comes to Ephraim, Ephraim means God made me fruitful in the land of my sorrow. And without getting into the details of what exactly he wants to forget and why he wants to forget it, the Hasidic reading is God put me in a place that would cause me to forget my father's home. The purpose of that is not to forget his father's home. The purpose of that is to remember not to forget. In other words, if you're not careful, you're going to forget your father's home, because this culture is actually is the antithesis of your father's home. So when Joseph wants to name his children and wants to remind himself of who he is and what's his spiritual identity, there's two stages. And just like the end of the parsha, we said there's two stages. There's remembering your past. That's Jacob being brought back to the land of Israel, but also thriving in the present and the future. And that's Joseph being within Egypt, with the people in Egypt. So a similar thing happens with Monash and Efrain. Menashe means remember the past. Be careful not to forget the past. And that's the first thing. The second step is if you don't forget your past, then you will be spiritually fruitful even in the challenging land. And that's Ephraim. Right? So the theme of you have to both remember the past in order to be fruitful and successful in the future, that appears in the beginning of the parsha and in the end of the parsha. And when things appear twice in the beginning and the end, you know that that's an important theme, because it's an important theme for us in general to how do we understand the exile. So on one hand, we yearn for the past. We yearn for the time when we lived in our true environment. But on the other hand, that never stopped us from actually being fruitful in the land of our sorrow. In other words, we're actually in some sense, we're more fruitful in exile than we would be able to be in the land of Israel. And this is true not only collectively for the collective Jewish people and nationally, but also individually and spiritually, because the soul comes into this world. The soul is going into exile. The soul is coming into Egypt. How does the soul, what's the soul's attitude to life on this earth? So the answer is there's a double attitude. First thing, we have to be very careful not to forget the taste of spirituality from the past. In other words, her father's home, the soul's father's home, which is connecting to spirituality. When you understand that if you're not careful, then the physical environment will threaten your spiritual sensitivity, and you can actually carve out time to remember the past, to dedicate time to spirituality, then you'll be able to actually be fruitful in the land of your sorrow. You'll be able to achieve the purpose of creation, which is right here in the physical world. But to do so, you first have to yearn for the spiritual. And if you connect it to the past, you'll be able to be so fruitful in the present and future. So I think that theme appears both at the end of the parsha and at the beginning of the parsha. So I think that's nice. Okay, if there's no comments, we'll jump straight in to read some of the poetry. Now
I do have a question.
Yes.
So are there any thoughts about why Monash and Ephraim are compared to Shimon and Reuven?
I think that, I don't know. I think that he's at least attempting to put Ephraim, who he puts first, as the firstborn, right? Reuven and Shimon are not just children of Jacob, but they're also the firstborn of Jacob. Now, in some sense, Joseph is going to become the firstborn, because that's why Joseph gets the double portion of the two tribes. So I'm not sure, but it seems to me that what he's saying is that Manasseh and Ephraim become like Reuven and Shimon. In some sense, they become the firstborn.
Thank you.
Now, what exactly is happening here? Before we even start the blessings, it's not clear what the blessings are. Are they blessings, conventional blessings? Some people read it that it's actually not so much blessings, it's trying to figure out what the spiritual destiny of each one of the tribes are, because really it's trying to figure out, trying to ask the question, who will be the leader? And the simple answer to that question is that there's no easy answer. When you read it superficially, it looks like Judah becomes the leader. But then also Joseph becomes a leader, but also Dan becomes the leader. And therefore, it's not so clear. And basically, over Jewish history, different tribes assumed the position of leadership depending on what that generation needed. So we get to the point where who's the true Jewish leader? It's not clear. We have at least a separation of powers, because we have Levi, who has the spiritual blessing. Doesn't have it here. Here he has the curse. But in Moshe's times, he gets the spiritual blessing, but also it could be alluded to here. Also, the bottom line is, one way to read this, I don't want to superimpose, one perspective here, but one way to read this is a quest to figure out what is the spiritual nature of each tribe, to figure out who's the leader. And the answer is Judah's the leader. However, there's other forms of leadership and other times where other tribes become the leader. So that's just by way of introduction. I'm going to do something here which is very ambitious. Try to read all of this in a few minutes. We'll try. If we fail, we'll continue next year, or we'll do it again next year. We'll do a do-over next year. Just remind me next year to start with the blessings of Jacob. Okay. Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather, and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days. Gather and listen, sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. You already, even in the English, you could hear the poetry, right? Repetition, changing the words, saying the same phrase in different ways. It's very poetic. You can't translate the poetry into English, but that was do the best we can. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the first of my might. The bracket says you should have been, but the verse says superior in rank and superior in power. The relentlessness of water, you shall not have superiority, for you ascended upon your father's couch. Then you profaned him who ascended upon my bed. So without getting into the details, the verse says that Reuven slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine. That's the verse. The rabbis say don't read it literally. It's more figurative. After Rachel passes away, it's don't read it literally. It really means he moved Jacob's bed from the tent of Bilhah to the tent of his mother Leah. Without getting into that story, the bottom line is you should have been the leader, but you're not. You dishonored your father. Okay. Now Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi also get rebuke. Simon and Levi are brothers. Stolen instruments are their weapons. What do we know about Simon and Levi? So what we know about Simon and Levi is, first of all, they killed the entire city of Shechem. So the father is silent until his deathbed. But on his deathbed, he said, you stole. Who did you steal? You stole from my brother Esav. If you look at the blessings to Esav, Isaac tells Esav, you will live on your sword. So Jacob tells his children, you have no business using a sword. You stole that from Esav. Let my soul not enter their council, my honor, you shall not join their assembly, for in their wrath they killed a man. Rashi says they killed the entire city of Shechem like one man, and with their will they hamstrung a bull. Who's the bull? According to Rashi, the bull is Joseph, because later we're going to compare Joseph to a bull. So here, Jacob suspects, it's not 100% clear if Jacob knows what happens with the sale of Joseph. At least according to the Rashi, he suspects that they're involved in that. And here he curses their wrath. Very interesting. Even if you're going to curse, never curse the person. He curses their wrath. Arur apam, cursed be their wrath, for it is mighty, and their anger because it is harsh. I will separate them throughout Jacob, and I will scatter them throughout Israel. And this is true. Both Shimon and Levi did not get a portion in the land of Israel. Levi becomes the priests, and they did not get a portion in the land. And even Shimon, they didn't have their own portion of the land. It was swallowed in within Reuven, but that's another story. Bottom line is, he's not giving them any position of leadership because they have too much anger. They have anger issues. When someone violated their sister, they went and they killed the entire city, which Jacob was not happy about it, not then and not now. Okay, now we get to Judah. Now the Medrash says, Judah is afraid because Judah has a whole list of sins that his father could rebuke. So Judah's like checking out. That's what Rashi says. And therefore he says, no, Judah, no, you're not going to be cursed. You're going to be blessed. Why? Torah doesn't say it here explicitly, because Judah is the example of transformation. Judah takes responsibility. Judah repents. That's the difference between Judah and everybody else. Not that nobody else sins, but Judah takes responsibility and he can correct his ways. So Judah, as for you, your brothers will acknowledge you. Your hand will be at the nape of your enemies, and your father's sons will prostrate themselves to you. A cub and a grown lion is Judah. This is beautiful. Rashi says cub. First you're a cub, then you're a grown lion. It refers to King David. First he was just a king over the tribe of Judah, and then he becomes the king over the entire people. From the prey, my son, you withdrew. He crouched, rested like a lion, and like a lion, who will rouse him? Rashi tells you exactly what this is referring to, but we don't have a time right now. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the student of the law from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him will be a gathering of peoples. So Shiloh is the Mashiach, and we're saying the scepter will not depart from Judah. There will always be kingship and leadership from Judah. And like Rashi says, even in Babylonia, after the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish people had some form of autonomy, the Reish Galuta, there was a position called the head of the exile arch, that was usually from the tribe of Judah. And now he's being blessed with wine. And in fact, if you go to the hills of Judea till today, you could find all that abundance of wine, or you can go to your local wine store and find the wine from the hills of Judah, which are described right here beautifully in verse 12, 11, and 12. He binds his foal to a vine, and to a tendril he binds his young donkey. He launders his garment with wine, and with the blood of grapes binds his raiment. In other words, the trees are so powerful, you can actually bind a donkey to just a branch of the vine. And of course, he's got so much wine that he actually launders his garments with wine. I don't recommend you do that, at least not in the literal sense, but figuratively, you should have enough wine that you could launder your garments in wine. Of course, this has many layers of meaning, including Kabbalistic meaning, which we discussed in years past. 12, he is red-eyed from wine and white-toothed from milk. Okay, so that's him. He's got plenty of milk as well. Milk represents that the goats have pasture in those mountains, and therefore they give forth good milk, and therefore his eye doctor is very happy. He's red-eyed from wine, and his dentist is very happy. His teeth are white from milk. Beautiful. Now we go to Zebulun. Zebulun will dwell on the coast of seas. He will be at the harbor of the ships, and his boundary will be at Sidon. Sidon is deep into Lebanon. He is the merchant, and if you're a merchant, you got to live next to the shipping ports, and that's what Zebulun was. Yissachar is a bony donkey lying between the boundaries. He saw a resting place that it was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and he bent his shoulder to bear burdens, and he became an indentured laborer. Different interpretations. It means, according to the Rashi, he submits to Torah, but it means simply that he was a farmer. He lived between the boundaries, in the valley of Israel. It's between Mount Tabor and other mountains, and he lives a life of peace as he's peaceful. When you're a merchant, you're always worried, right? You have to come, you have to go, you have to shop, you have to invest. The farmer has more of a simple, peaceful life. Dan will avenge his people. Literally, Yadin will judge or avenge his people like the tribes of Israel. Who was Dan? Rashi says this refers to Dan's descendants, Samson, and that's in verse 17. Dan will be a serpent on the road, a viper on the path, which bites the horse's heels, so its rider falls backwards. Rashi says this refers to Samson when he collapses the building with the leaders of the Philistines. Again, yes, even Dan, who was not the prominent tribe, he was not the leader, but at some point, leadership will come from Dan. In other words, every tribe has something to contribute. For your salvation, I hope, O Lord. Rashi says this is a prayer. Jacob praying for Samson. In any case, we get to God. God lives on the eastern bank of the Jordan. He needs to protect the border. He needs troops. He needs military strength. As for God, a troop will troop forth from him, and it will troop back in the tracks. If this is not poetry, I don't know what is. You ready for this one? Here's the way it sounds in Hebrew. Gad gedud yigudenu v'hu yagud akev. Gad gedud yigudenu. Okay, so it's playing with the sounds of the words. From Asher will come rich food, and he will yield regal delicacies. There's a tremendous amount of olive oil in Asher's land. That's the way Rashi explains. Naphtali is a swift gazelle. He is one who utters beautiful words. What does it mean he's a swift gazelle? Rashi says his land was in a place called the Valley of Ginusar, which is right outside of Tiberias, right next to the Sea of the Galilee. And there the fruits that are given forth are beautiful. And the fruit actually is the fruit that they're fastest to ripen in Israel. That's why they're a swift gazelle. Every Friday when I was living in Safat, I would drive down from Safat to Tiveria on Friday, and we would see the things growing. They had bananas, they had other things in the valley of Ginusar. Reminds me of Naphtali's blessing from Jacob. And here we come, what Jill alluded to is Joseph. Joseph gets a very long blessing. Only Judah gets a blessing almost as long. Here we go. A charming son is Joseph, a son charming to the eye. Women strode along to see him. They heaped bitterness upon him and became quarrelsome. Ye arches despised him. I guess this is the brothers that hate him. But his bow was strongly established, and his arms were gilded from the bands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there he sustained the rock of Israel. He held back his bow. He didn't take revenge. And here we have the blessings of giving Jacob the blessings of Jacob's parents. From the God of your father, and he will help you, and with the Almighty, and he will bless you. With the blessings of the heavens above, the blessings of the deep lying below, the blessings of father and mother, the blessings of your father surpass the blessings of my parents. The ends of the everlasting hills, may they come to Joseph's head and to the crown of the head of the one who was separated from his brothers. And then we get to Benjamin in top of 6. Benjamin is a wolf. He will prey. In the morning, he will devour plunder. And in the evening, he will divide the spoils. Beautiful Rashi. Rashi says there's the morning and there's the evening. The Jewish people in the land of Israel had a morning, had an evening, had a beginning and had an end. What was the beginning? The beginning is the first king. Who was the first king? Saul. Saul, Shaul, the tribe of Benjamin. What's the evening? The evening is once the temple was destroyed. What's the story of the evening? The story of Purim. Mordechai and Esther, who led the Jewish people and eventually were able to defeat their enemies, they were also from the tribe of Benjamin. So that's the morning and the end, according to one interpretation of Rashi. Every verse here has multiple interpretations. The bottom line here is that we don't have time to read everything, all the details, but what's clear is that for the first time in the book of Genesis, we understand that all 12 children, coming full circle, all 12 children are part of the Jewish story. Every person and every tribe has a contribution to make. And when you ask yourself, who is the leader? The answer is it depends. In some ways, Judah is the leader, but in other ways, other tribes are the leaders. So that is the story in short. Chazak, chazak, lit chazek, be strong, and they will be strengthened. It was an old custom that when you finish the Torah, when they would conclude the Torah at the Kiddush, you're supposed to have an extra kugel. I don't know if that was a joke or serious, but that's what the custom was. So either try to hear the conclusion of the Torah on Shabbat, or at least have an extra piece of kugel. In any case, Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful day. Questions, comments, please share. Otherwise, be well. We'll see each other in good health.